Hello and welcome to the Federal. I am Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay, your host of our program, Off the Beaten Track, in which we discuss one issue fairly threadbare. We will be talking about Indian politics. What else can we talk about? We are actually in what we say into the election season. Any day now, the Election Commission of India should be calling for assembly elections in 5 states. Within a few months, 6 to 7 months, they would be calling for the Lok Sabha elections. So it's going to be high voltage. There's going to be a lot of political heat. Now, to discuss all this, I am joined by a very reputed scholar. Welcome to the program, Gilles Verniers. Gilles, let me just introduce you to our audience. Has been a scholar of Indian politics and society for a fairly long period of time. He did his PhD on India, has been steadily tracking Indian politics for a fairly long time, and at least for more than a decade, we have been talking about Indian politics and Indian political parties. He is currently a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, Carl Lowenstein Fellow, visiting assistant professor in political science at the Amherst College in the United States. He's also the non-resident visiting scholar, Center for the Advanced Study of India. That's a fairly long and a tall order in terms of the amount of work which is tracking besides his research work. So Gil, first of all, thank you very much for coming and joining us on this very important discussion where we are actually talking just around the time when the election season is going to kick off. So let me ask you, begin off with a slightly different issue, not just about politics. We got to also remind our the viewers, who are watching it, that you have been in news, not for the reasons of your research, but for certain amount of controversy related to your previous stint at the Ashoka University, which has unfortunately come to an end under circumstances which we possibly would not actually go into great detail in our conversation. But it definitely raises, given what has happened in the last 2-3 months, it certainly raises the basic issue of academic freedom in India and the quality of democracy, especially the freedom of expression and the pursuit of academics in India. Now, it's perfectly understandable for public universities to be feeling a bit claustrophobic in the last few years, but also private universities, it appears, are not really being able to ward off the threat, or maybe they themselves are inclined to, don't want to really get into that, take a position. But as somebody who is involved with Indian academics, who's seen it for a fairly long period of time, how do you frame the basic issues of academic freedom that we are talking about?
Well, Nilanjan, first of all, thank you for having me. And you and I have been talking, for a very long time, but I think this is the first one what we get to do that, publicly. So I'm really glad we're doing this. Listen, the question of academic freedom, I think, is broader than, the question of one particular individual or one particular institution. There has been increased pressure on institutions of higher education across the board, as you say, more so, as you say, on public institutions, which of course the government, yields, more control and therefore can apply more, more easily, more pressure, but also on private institutions who have seen the context in which they operate change quite drastically. When we started Ashoka University now almost 10 years ago, we actually started in 2014, and the idea was to start to build, liberal arts university, but the challenge was to, how do you build a liberal arts institution in an environment that's growingly, illiberal, right? And so Ashoka is surrounded by, and other institutions are surrounded by, several concentric layers of, various forms of conservatism, and illiberalism, which is difficult to handle. What seems to be distinct about private institutions like Ashoka, but also perhaps others, is not so much that they respond to direct government pressure, but that they sort of anticipate expectations from the government and take measures which are meant to protect the institution, but at the same time violate principles of academic freedom. And so, as you are aware, a number of my colleagues at Ashoka have been sort of pushed out over the years. There's some sort of a pattern to it. But there's a larger context, there's a larger situation where it is more and more difficult in India to do research, to do social sciences, to ask political questions, or to ask social science questions in general. It is harder for foreign scholars to visit India and do their research. A number of scholars have been refused entry on India's territory. Some, OCI have been rescinded and so forth. So it's a whole climate of, growing pressure and growing intolerance also for, anyone who's asking, critical questions, be there academics, journalists, activists, human rights activists of various kinds.
We have actually faced pressures across the board. You actually said it, not just academics, but journalists and also the civil society activists, who have been very important to keep the conscience of this country alive. That is very important. The role of the civil society is very important. Now, let's actually move on from here to the core discussion point of it, the politics and the elections that are looming ahead of us. There is no point of repeating once again that this is possibly going to be one of the most important and critical periods in the political history of India. Let's start talking about the BJP, the ruling party. There is a sense that a few months back, especially in the early month of January specifically, the BJP seemed to be fairly comfortable. But in the recent weeks, it appears that the BJP of steps which they have taken, which suggests that they are actually under some kind of a pressure and feeling the a sense of a slightly greater challenge than what they were anticipating back in January. And this is primarily for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, the opposition leaders trying to have some kind of a seat adjustment or an understanding between each other in the maximum number of seats are possible. Currently, the goals are being set about 400 plus seats. That is what they are talking about. So by and large, that how are you looking at it? If we just say, that at a macro level, before we get to micro issues, at a macro level, how are you looking at the electoral narrative at the moment, if I can ask?
Yeah, so number of things. So first of all, one of the strengths of the BJP is that it never takes election outcomes for granted. In a way, they always fight an election as if they were, in a way, in the position of being challenged rather than being, rather than endorsing simply, the status of a dominant party that actually have in national politics. So they're always on their guard, they're always attentive, they're always proactive. And that obviously, works for them. They don't take, elections for granted. They don't take their own dominance for granted, which of course works for them. Second, also, and this is something that we have seen particularly in recent months, but it's been a pattern of the way, the BJP approaches politics and elections. They have been very effective at sort of bombarding the public with ideas, with topics of discussion in which they occupy a central role, right? The G20 was one of them, the special session of parliament recently with major, announcements on the election commission, on the women reservation bill, the incoming inauguration of the temple at Ayodhya. And so they have been extremely effective at occupying not just the public sphere, but also people's mind, being the object of discussion. And something that strikes me at the moment, and it's been going on for a while, is that while the opposition is still in a way busy sort of talking to one another, they talk to each other to sort of set up arrangements, seat sharing, ideas, program, and so forth, which of course is something that they must do. The BJP, on the other hand, is talking to the public. right? And an election is not just a battle of money and resource and organization, it's also a battle of ideas. And in that sense, the BJP retains an advantage because of its ability to sort of set the term of public discussion, right? The opposition is still reacting on what the government says, on what the prime minister says. They spend a lot of time talking to one another, but probably not spending enough time actually defending their ideas to the public.
So that is there. There is one more thing when we talk about the BJP. There is something else also which has been constantly said in the last few years, specifically after 2019, that the BJP has considerably changed under Mr. Modi. You know, everything that happens is obviously linked to a single leader. So there is a certain amount of, you know, credit being given only to Mr. Modi. So anyway, there has been a change. Among various things which is being talked about, a variety of things have changed. But most importantly, they say that the social base of the BJP has changed, that there is a greater tendency to make it a party of the OBC, not that of the upper caste as they used to be at one point of time. You know, that essentially a Baniya Brahmin party, you know, or that of the trader and the priestly class in the 60s, 70s, and even the 80s, 90s.
Yeah. So
You
I
have
see at least
studied this quite a lot, you know, in terms of
right.
OBC, and there is a different, you know, understanding that you have of what we call, you know, the pro-BJP analysts or the admissions.
Yeah. So I see three aspects to that question. So three major transformation that the BJP has undergone. The first one, as you said, the social base of the party have changed quite dramatically. If you look, relying on CSDS Logniti, election survey data, we know that the social base of the BJP is obviously larger, they get more votes, but also much more diverse. And something that was striking about the 2019 election is the progress that the BJP made among OBCs, among lower OBCs, but more particularly so among Dalits, right? And in subsequent state elections, also the BJP has made similar progress. And so, if you look at the social base of the BJP, it is very diverse. It is a snapshot, in a way, of the population. It cuts across, social bases. There are still variations. The degree of cohesiveness of support among upper caste for the BJP at the moment is still vastly superior than any other category, right? When we talk about progress of support among Dalits, it's roughly about 40% of Dalit voters in UP, for example. So that's still not a majority, but it's a very significant chunk. The second transformation is a claim that the BJP does, which it has itself as an organization become more representative. And it is true that they have made efforts at inducting members of a greater variety, a greater array of groups of caste within their organization. Right. They have also reached out to groups that historically have been neglected by regional parties or by the Congress, also non-dominant OBCs, across the Hindi belt. But the question is whether it actually converts into significant changes in terms of representation. Right. And here I base myself on data that we have collected over the years with a number of scholars, Christophe Jaffrelot, of course, being one of them, but also a large number of colleagues. And what we see is that the changes are not as dramatic as as the claims are made. What the BJP has succeeded in doing is, initially when they came to power in 2014, was to increase significantly the representation of traditional elites among the upper caste or among intermediary caste in other states, right? And the representation of OBCs has been somewhat constant, or has increased, slightly, but they have sort of changed the composition of OBCs that used to have representation, right? So a greater number of MPs coming from smaller groups who didn't get to much representation.
We said,
None yet of exactly right, but the diversification of OBC representation has not necessarily led to an overall change in representation, and has not diluted the overrepresentation that upper caste received in the BJP. So I'm looking at numbers, for instance, from the Hindi belt and from the BJP. And the numbers that we have is that nearly half of BJP's MP across the 178 seats that they have across the 10 states of the Hindi belts are upper caste. And the OBC represent 20%, or 28% if you add intermediary caste with them, which in North India is mostly Jats. And if you look at the history, yes, this number is only very slightly higher than in the late 90s during NDA 1 and 2, where you had 19% of OBC representatives, where you had 7-8% of intermediary caste, right? So the overall share is not that different compared to the rest. What has changed is the discourse of inclusion. It's the targeting of non-dominant OBCs. But the question that I ask is whether these transformations have led to a significant transformation of the balance of power within this group, within the party.
Does not.
And that leads me to my third transformation, which is all this discourse of inclusion happens at the same time of a process of extreme centralization and concentration of power within the BJP. What is the meaning of inclusion if it's not accompanied by real power sharing, right? And so you can bring up numbers about the number of OBC ministers, but then you should ask at the same time how relevant ministers are to India's governance, to policy, to decisions. We know that there has been an extraordinary process of concentration of power both within the party. It is a two-man party, basically, but also within government with the increased role of the PMO.
Two-man is set, with a slight amount of hesitation by a large number of people. It's essentially a one-man party who's the final authority is just one person. There was, while you were citing the data, you referred to the northern states, where the BJP has won 178 seats. Now, from here, actually, I come to two questions which have been there in my mind for a long time. And I thought that if I ever am talking to you, then I'll be raising these. One is that somehow or the other, the BJP has not been able to crack southern India. Karnataka is there. It has been there from the 1991 Lok Sabha elections. I was very fortunate to have covered that. And actually, since that the BJP would win at least one seat, they ended up winning two in the 91 elections. Barring of Karnataka, and initially it appeared that Andhra, Telangana, they would be able to do some, but it appears that somehow or the other, the narrative is not building. Tamil Nadu initially, when the Ram Janmabhoomi movement started, was considered to be a very appropriate state for them because of the deep religiosity, but they've simply not been able to have their own roots in Tamil Nadu. So one is the question that why have they not been able to crack the southern code? The second issue is that it is slightly bigger. You have watched the Sangh Parivar politics for a fairly long period of time. Their central idea is essentially to talk about the 1,000 years of slavery that they keep on talking about. Even Mr. Modi talked about while he was in the US, he talked about the 1,000 years of foreign rule. So that is there. Somehow or the other, I get the impression, and I've argued and written also, that the Sangh Parivar's idea of Bharat is essentially North, Central and Western India. It leaves out large parts of Eastern India, Northeastern India and Southern India definitely. They do not take into account that Islam first came to India, Southern India on the coastal side. How do you react to these two questions which I have posed? The Southern Code and the idea of Bharat being very geographically restricted.
Yeah. So at first hand, it may look like a puzzle, right? Because southern India is no less religious, than the north. Caste is as entrenched, if not more entrenched, in the south as in the north. There were recent figures about the resilience of untouchability. Tamil Nadu was pretty high, across states in India. And so it would look like, this mix of caste and religiosity could sort of prepare a ground favorable, to the BJP, which has the resource to build organization pretty well wherever it wants. But that's not what we are observing, right? And if you look at state elections in particular, and recent Lok Sabha elections as well, which are the areas where the BJP still face the most challenges or is still incapable of sort of, building, a base for itself. These are regions that are where politics is driven by a very strong sense of regional identity, with an identity narrative which can be pitted against the identity narrative that the BJP vehiculates. The BJP historically is a North Indian party. It is a Hindi belt party. It has obviously spread quite significantly in the West, in the East, in the Northeast, and so forth. But the overall vision of India, the Hindu nationalism that drives them, is essentially a North Indian Hindi-speaking formulation, right? And parties that are able...
With co-option I'm saying with co-option from Western India.
With co-option from Western India, yes, of course. But in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, in West Bengal, these are, strongly, these are states equipped with, a strong sense of regional identity. It's linguistic. It's almost civilizational, right? I remember the last election in Tamil Nadu, the DMK was presenting itself as a defensor of Tamil civilization against the imagery of northern invaders. And Mamata Banerjee plays also on Bengali regionalism and regional identity, in a similar fashion. And so it sort of illustrates the point I was making earlier about elections being a battle of ideas, right? These states, and the regionalist parties that are dominant in those states actually have a narrative that they can use to counter the BJP. The BJP has tried to co-opt allies. They've poached people, individuals. They've made an alliance with the ADMK, which is now defunct. But none of that actually has none of that has actually succeeded.
Expand social base.
Yeah. No, exactly. On the second aspect of your question,
well, you said it that BJP essentially remains a Hindi party at heart. So I think it answers the question. Yeah. It's language policy. It's way of looking at the idea of India. The sense of history that they talk about is so much North Indian. The moment you talk about 1,000 or 1,200 years of Islamic invaders coming into India and subjugating Hindus, that is the history of Northern India that they're talking about. They're not talking about the process of assimilation with Islam.
Yeah. And there are also differentiated historical legacies. Obviously, partition, affected, collective imaginaries, far more in the north than the south, and so forth. I mean, you could multiply examples.
Just one quick question on the BJP before we actually have one or two points to discuss about the opposition also. 2019 was said to be a mixture of a large, big, ultra-nationalist narrative and the welfarist policies of Mr. Modi. 10 years down the line, some anti-incumbency sentiment may be there. How much do you think the welfare schemes that Mr. Modi keeps on talking about, we have given this, toilets have been made, gas cylinders have been made, and keeps on listing out of how important is it going to be, especially in what we can actually call the Hindutva belt, the BJP.
So these welfare schemes have been extremely important for the BJP for at least two aspects. One, it's a material proof, it's a material demonstration of the politics of inclusion, right? Everyone's a beneficiary. And second, it's been, the greatest vehicle or prop of communication sort of ever designed, with the hyper-personalization of welfare distribution, right? The plastering of the face of the prime minister on each and every item that gets distributed, from vaccine certificates to, ration goods and so forth. And so it's also a useful tool to counter the depressed economic climates, because the association that a lot of members of the public make, with the government and Mr. Modi is the one who provides support in difficult times, while not necessarily assigning responsibility to the same individual for the depressed economic climate or the difficulties that they may face. And so, for all these reasons, those welfare schemes obviously are very important, and they are also necessary, because given growth of inequalities and the destruction of jobs and so forth, and the whole economic climate, people need those goods, those public goods, and so that has been, of course, a source of strength. And but there's another element, which is something that a colleague of mine, Nilanjan, has developed in an argument, which is to say that national elections tends to be fought on large ideas and national issues of nationalism and national pride and Hindutva and external threat and national security. These are all areas that do not offer, much possibility for accountability. Right. If an election is fought purely on economic issues, then people can, look at their own situation and see the gap between what is being told to them and their own situation. But in a way, the threat of China, the threat of Pakistan, national security, pride, I mean, these are in a way symbolic and intangible, or Canada. These are sort of intangible elements, right? Where there is a strong element of belief that Mr. Modi is the right person to address all these issues.
That somebody, also the story that Mr. Modi has enhanced the reputation and the prestige of India, G20 being presented as a great success of just because of one individual. That is the way it is.
In that regard, they have been quite effective at manufacturing collective amnesia, because I've been in India since the late 90s, and I remember at the time, I actually came to India on 15th August 1997, which was India's 50th anniversary. And I remember Indians being very patriotic, having a great sense of national pride. India, there was a very positive, upbeat discourse about India's and the growth story and the tech story, and India was being courted already. What the BJP has done to a large extent is to transform the terms of national pride, right? Or the terms in which India sees itself, speaks about itself, presents itself to the world, and also domestically. Basically, terms that are infused with nationalism, but in a more aggressive kind of nationalism, and more. I remember Shah Rukh Khan's movies in the 90s. They were full of symbols of diverse India, multicultural India, multi-ethnic, multi-religious.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, right? It's the terms of national pride have been changed for something that's more exclusionary, that privileges one community over minorities, over others. So it's not that people didn't have a sense of pride before. It's not that India didn't have a positive image before, but of course, the geopolitical context has changed. India has changed, and unfortunately, of course, the population has changed. It's a younger population. which does not necessarily, remembers the past, or
And
has not been encouraged to remember the past.
a more angry population. That is something very discerning, at least in North, Central, and Western India, that the average person on the street, you are more likely to come across anger much quicker than what it used to be 2 decades or 3 decades back. Let me take Yeah, so sorry, please carry on.
Yeah, I mean, we see that with recent event of violence surrounding religious processions. I mean, Ganesh Chaturthi was, I mean, in my memory, in my recollection, was always a peaceful festival. It was always joyful, and people from across religion would sort of join. But now these processions are accompanied by, as you say, anger and violence, which is a very concerning development.
There used to be historically, religious processions have always been cause for conflict, communal conflict. Even in the late 19th century, the entire Ganesh festival, which was started by started on that note. But yes, this has become much more manifest now, and it is there everywhere. So vigilantism is suddenly now mainstream politics. That is something which is terrible, which has happened in the last 10 years. One last question, emerging out of what we are talking about, the dangers that you see and how you're saying that India has changed. The opposition, this was a question which I also asked, Professor Christophe Jaffrelot a couple of months back. Opposition, what should it do? Should it contest the BJP on ideological issues only, or should it focus on economic issues? Or should it try to see what works best somewhere and keep on, hit and trial method?
I don't see, necessarily a contradiction. It's not necessarily an either or. I mean, you cannot neglect ideas for a sort of programmatic issues, and you cannot focus on ideology and totally ignore, economic issues and social issues and others. I think the job of the opposition, first and foremost, is to make clear what their vision of India is, what their vision of the direction that the country should take, and how it actually contrasts with what the BJP proposes. Right. If it tries to fight the election on grounds that are favorable to the BJP, they're going to lose. It's not going to be effective. And so there is a ground for a real debate of ideas and a real confrontation of ideas around the question of reservations. Right? While the BJP claims to become more inclusive, they also have objectively diluted reservation benefits, at least for the groups that were initially targeted for. And so what the opposition is trying to formulate is basically the idea that we're not just going to be inclusive, symbolically, but also in terms of actual policy, right? And of course, reservation, which is something the BJP has always been against and cannot really make a credible defense of, is a point where the opposition can sort of distinguish itself. But that's just one area. They need to think about, what is their idea of nationalism? What is their, so how should Indian, according to them, should feel proud of themselves, but in ways that do not lead to marginalization and violence and stigmatization of others. Right. And they need to defend these ideas, right? But if they focus only on one aspect, it's going to be insufficient, because another strength of the BJP is that it's not holding one discourse. It's holding 5, 6, 7, 10 discourses at the same time, and people can pick which discourse sort of clicks for them, or they can support. And so the opposition has to be present, has to be heard on a wider range of ideas, and not just the one idea that they think will be effective. But that's where the issue also lies, which the degree of dominance that the BJP has over the public sphere, over mainstream media, does not provide a ground for a fair fight. The conditions so we may have free and fair or satisfactorily free and fair elections in the way they are organized, but the conditions for fair competition are not exactly met, given the imbalance of resources, but also the capacity of the BJP to spread its message constantly, to saturate the public sphere with the image and the voice of the prime minister. It's not just the image, it's the voice also. Radio, television, constantly, right? And how mainstream media also sort of act as a relay and amplifier, right? And so another challenge for the opposition is to make itself heard when it needs to be heard, not in the South, not in the East, but in the Hindi heartland.
Right. So there are challenges. It is actually a very delicate situation where we are all poised. The next few months are going to be very critical for India's political history. And as we move into the election season, I hope to speak to you again to be able to keep track and make sense of what is happening and the direction that we are going as a nation and as a people. Thank you very much, Gilles, for sparing time and being so lucidly being able to explain some of the things that we spoke about. Of course, we could have spoken for much longer given the number of issues which can be spoken about. But, well, thank you for the moment. That's all.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more news and updates.